In the political sphere, factions do not always fight among themselves, thereby neutralizing one another. Rather, they can and often do join together to loot the people. Now, they may fight among themselves over the division of the political spoils that are on the table, but they will generally cooperate to create a pool of spoils on the table to be divided. And I give you the classic example of log rolling, legislative process by which one faction has Bill A and another faction has Bill B, and you could never get a majority for Bill A if that were the only thing proposed. You could never get a majority for Bill B if that were the only thing proposed. But faction A and B agree, I'll vote for yours if you vote for mine, and both A and B are passed, and we get the worst possible result, simply because the factions have decided to cooperate in looting the rest of the general public. In the legal sphere, too, factions never fight over the doctrine of the living Constitution. They all accept that doctrine because it's the source of every unconstitutional power they want to employ. And in the technological sphere, remember, Madison believed that an extended republic would create, in his words, greater obstacles opposed to the concert and accomplishment of the secret wishes of an unjust and interested majority. Madison did not foresee, however, how modern technology would make it much easier for factions to discover their own strength and to act in unison while keeping from the people what's really going on, or even brainwashing people into believing that what the factions want is actually socially desirable when in fact it's socially destructive. Now, the second primary reason that Madison's theory works in only one direction is that people usually can't be organized to fight back effectively against political factionalism. And here I would encourage people to go out and find the book, The Logic of Collective Action, by a man named Menker Olson, which really is an explanation of this problem in economic terminology. But it boils down to essentially this, as far as what we're talking about is concerned. Factions always tend to be relatively small and self-conscious groups. They know who they are, they know what they want, and they have an idea of how to go about getting it. Also, the benefits to each member of a faction from some act of political looting tend to be relatively large. Whereas, although taxpayers in number are quite great, they tend to be disorganized. They generally lack any sense of their mutual interests. They generally lack any sense of their mutual political power. Also, the cost to each taxpayer from some particular act of political looting tends to be quite small. So taxpayers will probably do little or nothing to oppose each one of these acts because the cost to them will outweigh the benefits. Let's give an example. Let's assume that each member of a faction is looking forward to a $10,000 benefit coming from some piece of congressional transfer payment legislation. That member might be willing to expend up to $9,999 to get that $10,000. He would still profit. But let's assume he might only have to expend $1,000 in cash and effort to lobby to obtain that benefit of $10,000. It's fairly easy to see that that's a good return on investment. But a taxpayer might only face $1 in increased taxes to pay for that extra $10,000 going to all those factions. Would that taxpayer expend $1,000 in cash and other resources to lobby against that bill in order to save himself $1 or $1.50? Obviously not. And on top of all of this, we find that taxpayers are generally not educated and organized to take that kind of action anyway, whereas factions are educated and organized and have huge lobbying groups throughout the country designed specifically to focus on these kind of problems. The third primary reason that Madison's theory works in only one direction is that factions can, and if they have any strategic sense at all, will try to act through non-representative institutions. Remember, Madison's theory is based on the concept of a republic, which is a representative form of government, in which we have voting by the people. So if factions can work outside of that system, they completely defeat his theory at the first level. And in particular, factions have discovered how to do this through the judiciary, because the judiciary can misinterpret the Constitution in favor of governmental powers that enable the most influential factions to feather their own nests without the public's being able to do anything about it through the electoral process. So here, even if a faction embodies a visible, distinct, unpopular, and permanent minority in society, it can nevertheless gain supreme power in some area, which is, again, exactly the opposite of what Madison said. He was worried about factions coalescing into a majority, and through the use of the judiciary, a minority faction can gain this power without any hope of becoming a majority. Give an example, Madison's explicit fear, rage for paper money. How did we get that in this country? Well, there were some statutes passed, but it was primarily the court that gave it to us. Knox versus Lee, Juilliard versus Greenman, the Gold Clause cases, and essentially it gave that power to the banking class, the financial class in this country, which is a definite minority. Literally dozens of decisions the Supreme Court has completely misconstrued the General Welfare Clause, the Commerce Clause, I could list a number of others, to turn them into veritable fountainheads for factions to gain specific benefits. Roe versus Wade, maybe the ultimate example. Roe versus Wade and the abortion decisions created the incredible platform for factionalism that some human beings are not persons at all. Well, if you can deny people the right to life, I guess you can deny them all rights, right? So I don't know how much further than that factionalism could go unless we come to the recent decision in Lawrence versus Texas, in which the Supreme Court has said that traditional morality cannot be used as a basis for legislation, but that recourse to foreign law can be. So the open-ended nature of this is astounding. Well, all of this is really not accidental. It derives from the fact that since the late 1800s, a self-conscious, professionally organized faction has worked to dominate the law schools, the courts, and the legislatures. And this is what Associate Justice Antonin Scalia calls the law profession culture. And Madison certainly did not foresee that. Now, what's my conclusion here? Because it all sounds very doomish and gloomish. Well, I go back to an earlier decision of the Supreme Court, Anderson versus Dunn, in which it articulated what I consider one of the most foolish utterances it's ever articulated. It said, "The science of government is the most abstruse of all sciences, if indeed that can be called a science which has but few fixed principles, and practically consists in little more than the exercise of a sound discretion applied to the exigencies of the state as they arise. It is the science of experiment." Well, my goodness, if the science of government in this country has few fixed principles, what's the Constitution? Right? If it practically consists in little more than the exercise of a sound discretion, what's the Bill of Rights? All right, so even in 1821, ideas of this nature had seeped into the Supreme Court thinking. But the one that interests me most is this concept that the science of government is the science of experiment, because, of course, that is impossible. You cannot experiment in the field of human action because you cannot control all the variables the way you do in a laboratory. Rather, society must operate on the basis of precepts that derive from deductive reasoning, from moral and philosophical and metaphysical first principles that are as sound and sure as the human mind can discover. Well, I can give you two of those that I think are self-evident ones. One is that power can be checked only by countervailing power. And the other is that no good end can arise from the employment of a bad means. So the attainment of the general welfare requires not some mechanical system with inherent contradictions, as Madison tried to set up, but the imposition of some real constitutional control and restraint on factions themselves, not reliance on the factions to limit themselves in some way, or trust in the perverse principles that good results will somehow come from their bad motives. And that means not just written restraints, what many of the Founding Fathers rightly derided as paper checks, but physical restraints. That is, one or more powers independent of and superior to the political regime, not only in the legislative but also in the judicial branch, that can actually control these branches by deterring and, if necessary, punishing their excesses. And this will require what I call the 3 M's of constitutional reform. I'm referring here to meaning, money, and the militia. I start with meaning. If the meaning of the Constitution is out of we the people's control, then people become the subjects and the target of someone else's misinterpretation of the Constitution, rather than the authors, the objects, and the beneficiaries of the Constitution. So control of power of constitutional interpretation in the people's hands will require reassertion of the doctrine that judges can be impeached and convicted constitutionally and perhaps removed by other statutory mechanisms as a means to discipline them when they make egregiously unconstitutional decisions, deprive them of their office, and thereby strip the law profession culture, that particular faction, of the ability to exercise power in a non-representative manner through misinterpretation of the Constitution. But even that's not sufficient. Second M is money, because we're talking before, factionalism works through redistribution of wealth. And actually, the ultimate mechanism for doing that is monetary manipulation, because you can raise just taxes just so high before the voters begin to vote no. You can run monetary manipulations to the degree that they destroy the entire economic system before most people wake up. So here we're talking about control of the power of the purse in the people's hands, which will entail reintroduction of constitutional money, of silver and gold, to make money and therefore average Americans' economic security independent of politicians and judges. And thirdly, the militia, control of the power of the sword in the people's hands, which will entail revitalization of what the Constitution calls the militia of the several states, in order to deter and punish the criminal politics of factionalism by main force, if necessary. Because ultimately, as the Second Amendment points out, a well-regulated militia is necessary to the security of a free state. Not even money or a particular constitutional method of interpretation, but a well-regulated militia. I have been working on all three of those for many years. In principle, they can be done. In practice, they're extremely difficult. And ultimately, it depends on the kind of people who listen to talks of this nature to provide the wherewithal and the impetus to get the job done. Thank you.